I hope to begin a series of short segments on the Gospel of Mark. I think it's a good gospel to deal with. Most scholars believe it's the first gospel uh, that made any impact. It's the earliest of the four gospels in the New Testament. Matthew and Luke follow it to a large extent, and John knew of it directly or indirectly. And if we can understand what I want to call the skeleton of Mark and see the flesh that has been put on it, we might gain some insights into exactly what kind of compositions we find in the New Testament and especially in the Gospels, and what we can know of the historical Jesus, and then how uh, he and the Jesus event has been presented in a very creative and profound way that we call inspired scripture. So that the Gospel of Mark can be read in various ways. I remember that I took a course on the Gospel of Mark at a fine divinity school many years ago with a Greek Orthodox archbishop who is really the head of all the Greek Orthodox. I think he's still alive for the Americas. He had gotten his PhD at Harvard, studied under some great scholars there, but what he taught back in 1984, 85, completely different from what I did for my dissertation on Mark some 15 years later or so. But there are different ways of looking at it. Um, I centered on the temple in Mark, especially the famous event of Jesus chasing out the buyers and the sellers, chapter 11. But to really understand that, I found that I needed to read the whole gospel from beginning to end as a whole and try to get an idea of what it was all about. And I can summarize what I think the Gospel of Mark is primarily about as the presentation of Jesus as the Son of God, which is what the very title says, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, which makes a bookend with the centurion's confession when he sees how Jesus dies in chapter 15, I think verse 39. And so the topic is Jesus, the Son of God. What does Son of God mean, though? You can't jump several centuries to Nicaea or Chalcedon and get into Trinitarian hypostases formulations. Son of God in the Bible is Israel in Exodus 4, the firstborn son of God. Sons of God are the members of the divine council, later made angels. The Messiah is the Son of God, adopted perhaps, as in Psalm 2. And you also have a righteous sufferer, a pais theou in the Book of Wisdom, or uh, especially there, uh, who is called the Son or servant of God. But of course, in Christianity, you have a unique use of this term. Jesus is God's special Son. This is where you get the Abba type address to God, which is the address that a child would say to his very own father. Sometimes people like to translate daddy or something. I don't think the scholars like that, but they do stress that it is the personal address of a child, son, to his father. And in the Gospel of Mark, this sonship of Jesus is known only to the narrator, to Jesus, to the Father, and to the centurion, the first human being, only when Jesus has died. Before that time, the demons are the ones who have a preternatural, non-natural recognition of the real nature of Jesus. Otherwise, you could mistake what this Son of God means. I think Peter, for example, if you look at the confession of Peter in chapter 8, he confesses Jesus to be the Christ without any more embellishment, not the Son of the living God or the Christ of God as in Matthew and Luke, but simply the Christ, understood as a Messiah who would maybe smash the heads of the enemies of Israel, etc. And Jesus immediately admonishes Peter that he has to suffer and be rejected, and Peter says that must never happen to you, etc. So no one understands the mission of Jesus. And so the gospel in many ways is going to be a leading up to exactly what it is that this Son of God is going to do. And I think you can begin with the baptism of Jesus, where the heavens open and he has a revelation with the voice from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am pleased." The Spirit comes down into him. This makes a bookend with the death of Jesus, where the temple curtain is torn from top to bottom. In Greek, the same verb to split, the heavens were split, or the temple curtain was split. It's the schizophrenia verb. The splitting is related. Isaiah has this famous line, "Would that you rent the heavens and come down." The gospel is proclaiming that with Jesus, the heavens are open and God has come down to earth, intervened finally after a long sleep. There was no prophecy, there was nothing for 400 years in the Jewish tradition since the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, 400 years before Christ. There are no prophets. So John the Baptist is a real innovation there. He's the awakening again of divine activity in the new creation, the final, definitive intervention of God. And so the gospel can be seen as a preparation to understand that the Son of God delivered himself to sinners for us. And that's the mystery of his nature, already adumbrated or foreshadowed in the baptism, with these echoes of the sacrifice, so-called sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22. You are my beloved, darling son, as Isaac is called in Genesis, in whom I am pleased. That would be an echo of Isaiah 42, the first servant song, which is a set, I think, in Isaiah that is going to be relevant to understanding Jesus in Mark. And The Spirit, of course, coming down into Jesus is also reminiscent of Isaiah 42. I have put my Spirit on him. And you could even then jump to Isaiah 61, which can be considered the fifth of the servant songs in Isaiah, where the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor, etc. So from the baptism of Jesus, I think you see the shadow of the cross there. And I think that will be a subtopic or a main topic or an underlying topic in the Gospel of Mark. I think that there's a polemic with the temple, in that the functions of the temple, according to the Gospel of Mark, have become obsolete. Jesus is the one that heals, cleans lepers, which could not be done in the Old Testament. That's what Elijah, I think, says when Naaman wants to be cleaned of leprosy. He says, am I God to clean a leper? The priest in Israel could examine a somehow cured leper, and leprosy, of course, meant all kinds of skin diseases that may go away, psoriasis or eczema or something. And when he examined him, he would be able to determine you're fit to return to cultic life and the temple, etc. That's what Jesus tells the leper in chapter 1 of Mark. Go show yourself to the priests. And then the translation would have to be as a witness against them, but we'll have to get to that later. And he's the one that heals this woman with the blood flow in chapter 5, which is dovetailed, intertwined with the raising of Jairus' daughter. So you've got a 12-year-old daughter, a woman bleeding for 12 years. Jesus is on his way to see Jairus' daughter. This woman touches him. He's touched the leper, which would be an impure thing to do. Now he allows an impure woman, menstruating woman, to touch him. And the language is mixed. I will be healed. I will be saved. Your faith has saved you. So healing and being saved are interchangeable. Just like healing or cleansing and forgiveness is also related and interchangeable. You know, interestingly enough, in Mark, Jesus has a supper and is anointed by this unnamed woman, not Mary Magdalene or Mary, the sister of Lazarus, somebody like that, but some unnamed woman in the house of Simon the leper. So that might be some connection there. In any case, and he's also the one who gives his life as a ransom for many, Mark 10:45. So when you think of this word ransom, you think of this kofar that is mandated in Exodus 30. It's like a toll tax for those crossing over into the land in the, after the Exodus. They pay a temple tax or shekel, half a shekel in silver. In the time of Jesus, it had to be in Tyrian shekels with a purity of silver that was higher. And that was the reason for the money changers. So when you look at the Temple Act in Mark, and you see that he throws everyone out, buyers and sellers, he catastrophizes the tables of the money changers and dove sellers. Doves would be the offering of poor people, like a leper or a woman with a blood flow who has been healed. He is the one who fulfills what the temple simply symbolized. And Mark is the one who explicitly, I think, explains this or illustrates this by flanking the temple act with the fig tree episodes. So you have a fig Newton, so to speak, or a fig sandwich, where Jesus sees the fig tree, leafy, seeks fruit. It's not the kairos, it's not the season or time for figs or fruits. The time of the kingdom has arrived, Mark 1:15. The time is fulfilled, kairos is fulfilled. And then he does the temple act. And then the following morning, they see the fig tree, second part of the fig tree, Newton, so to speak. And they see that, and now Peter says the fig tree you cursed has dried from the roots up. And so that symbolizes what I've called the infarct to the temple that Jesus gives it. In other words, he stops the blood flow in the temple as a symbol of the cessation of its activities. Of course, chapter 2 later, he's going to say, not a stone will remain upon a stone that shall not be destroyed. Very interesting. So that in Mark, you have unique to Mark. He allowed no vessel to be transported through the temple. So this word vessel, which in Latin vas, blood vessel, you would say these are vessels for part for carrying blood. Temple kol, you can look this word up in Hebrew or Greek in the Old Testament. It's often used for the temple utensils. And only, or Mark is the one that began the quote, or has the quote. I think Matthew seems to copy him. Luke has a very different type of version, very minimized version of the Temple Act. But in Mark, he quotes Jeremiah 7:11. You have made this into a cave of bandits. In a chapter in Jeremiah, chapter 7, which is all about the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians or Neo-Babylonians. So he quotes that, and then he quotes Isaiah about opening up the temple as a house of prayer for all nations, sort of downplaying the sacrificial. At least Mark does. Isaiah is a little different, but in any case, Mark has a unique way of presenting this, which is very interesting. It could be a dramatization of who Jesus is rather than a historical event as colorful as we picture it. John is the one that makes it into a cord of a whip of cords, and large animals are chased out, and people, of course, like the topic of no commerce in the temple. And then of thieves, is a translation that goes along with that. King James, but it's then, okay, it's really a cave, and really the thieves, even in Greek, the lestai, are the revolutionaries of Josephus and of the people crucified with Jesus, and in Peritzim in Hebrew are bloodshedders. These are not pickpockets or people that charge too much for the sacrifices, for the money changing. That's like almost falls into a Jewish stereotype moneylender thing. Now these are violent people, and the indication of that is going to be the parable of the wicked murderous tenants who represent the whole history of Israel. The prophets are sent diligently time and again, as Jeremiah 7 says. They are rejected, beaten, killed, and then the crazy thing that God does is, they haven't respected my emissaries. Let me send my beloved son in the end. They'll respect him. I mean, that's crazy. They say, no, this is the heir. Let's kill him. And so you have there, in a nutshell, the Christian confession. God sent his prophets, spoke to the prophets in the days of old. In the end, he spoke through a son. That's the first verse of the letter to the Hebrews, whom he has made heir of all things. So you see the strong parallels there. So this is all sort of Christology. Who is Jesus in the Gospel of Mark? And we could certainly go on for various sessions, because as you can see, this supposedly simplest of Gospels is incredibly profound. I will end by referring to an image I like. We see the tip of the iceberg, and we can scuba dive as deep as the oxygen tank allows and discover the whole substructure, infrastructure, foundation, etc., that is simply decried or just seen in a glimpse with the superficial reading of it. As for example, with, Jesus was against commerce in the temple, so for the period of time that the temple was going to last, another 40 years till it was destroyed by the Romans that he predicted in chapter 13. For that period of 40 years, no commerce in the temple. That is a superficial understanding that the temple and sacrifices don't go together, or you don't have to sell the sacrifices, so that you could sell them someplace else and then transport the animal far distance and risk that they become blemished, etc. These are the kinds of things that I hope we can explore, but I don't want to prolong this any longer. I'm afraid I've probably gone over 15 minutes anyway, so let's stop there.